Welcome everyone to, not Train Tuesday. This is the Athearn Extra 3.7 we're at now. And hope you are all enjoying your summer. We got a few people slowly making their way to the live stream. Get out there and get some comments going. I'll do some shout outs here in a minute. But yeah, hope you guys are having a great summer. Just a quick reminder too, Train Tuesday will return live October 1st. That's a Tuesday. And I'm sure some of you are looking forward to that. I am looking forward to cooler days and nights that I can work on the layout, whether it be the N scale one behind me or the HO scale layout in the other room. Looking forward to that. And we've got some shows coming up in the fall into the winter, so that'll be a chance for me to meet some of you guys in person. Looks like we got a few people joining right now. It looks like I've got Southwest Railroad joining us. Thanks for joining us, Sid. It's great to see you again. I know you've missed me, but only a few more weeks and you can see me live every Tuesday. Anthony is here. Thanks, Anthony, for joining us. We're going to have a pretty good show tonight. We have got a special guest, and we're going to be talking a little bit about DCC. We're going to be talking about probably Blue Nami, Tsunami 2, Econami, but we're also going to be talking about other things as well that have to do with model railroading and how our guests got to where they're at. I see Model Railroaders joined the chat. Thanks for joining us. And let's go ahead and get started. Now, one thing too, I want to remind you is I'll interview our guest. And then after that, if we've got time for questions, that'll give you a chance to ask questions to our guest or to Athearn, and we'll answer as many as we can before we run out of time. So, our guest is probably known as the guru of DCC. If you've gone to a RPM or a model railroad show recently, you have probably seen this gentleman at a booth with a purple shirt on, and he is a most engaging model railroader. He works for SoundTraxx, of course, and he is a great ambassador to not only SoundTraxx, but to the hobby in general. I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Mr. George Bogatiuk. George, welcome aboard.
Howdy, everyone. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday.
I had to look again because with Labor Day, my whole week screwed up.
Yeah, I hear you. In fact, I don't even know. It still feels like August to me because Illinois is hot.
June to me.
Yeah. So, okay, for maybe the one or two people out there that don't know who you are, give us a quick background. Who is George and what does he do at SoundTraxx?
So, my name is George Bogatiuk. My official title is product specialist, and it's kind of an all-encompassing umbrella term because I've primarily deal with the retailers, making sure that the stores are keeping product on the shelf, and answering questions for their staff and things like that, helping them sell the product. But I've also done tech support. I've also done shipping. I've also done invoicing. I've also helped in the engineering department when it comes to defining what certain features are, things like that. So that's kind of why I get the term product specialist. I also help your R&D staff when they have questions about how they're setting up decoders, things like that. And I try to catch as many of those as I can so that we can get them the correct answer. So there's less, back and forth. Let's jump on top of it. But I've actually been here for 16 years, just under 16 years. I turned 16 the end of October.
Oh,
so
wow.
The way this year has been going, that'll feel like a week. And we'll be at the end of October and already packing up for Train Fest. So
Yeah.
It's going to come fast. So I just turned, so I'll be turning 16 years here. And I know this sounds really cliche, but I mean, it's the honest truth is I don't feel like I've worked in 16 years. Because I get to talk to model railroaders, I get to talk to, retailers, trying to help keep them informed of what's going on their store. And I get to travel around, like Jim mentioned, to all the different shows, go and do various layout tours, things like that. So I mean, I'm just living it. I've been a hobbyist since I was 14, really serious anyway. And so one of the things I enjoy doing is also doing presentations on clinics, talking about all the features that we built into the decoder, all the cool things you can do to more realistically mimic the actual work that the railroad's doing, using your decoders, and being able to share that information. I know Jim mentioned the DCC guy up front, and I do know a lot of that, but a lot of that knowledge has come from after I joined the industry, because I was the quote unquote guru, which I don't like necessarily that particular term. And the reason I don't like it is because when I was at my train club back in the Dallas Fort Worth area, where I'm originally from, I was the guru and I didn't know squat compared to what I know now. So I figured out that most clubs have this guru guy that's figured out how to run a train, and everybody goes to him with the questions. And that's basically what I was. I would run my trains, and everybody looked up at me because my stuff ran, because I actually took the effort to read the manuals and so forth. So that's part of why I'm not a huge fan of that term, because I think it's overused. But anyway, but my point being is that after being in the industry, I've learned so much more of the nuts and bolts, the fine details of how DCC works. And one of my favorite things is to be able to share that with you as the modeler, because a lot of us, first off, none of us are born knowing how to model railroad. We all have to, someone has to teach you how to build bench work. Someone has to teach you how to lay track, or someone has to teach you how to paint a model or put together a kit or whatever the case is. And, today's world, that's a lot different, because most of it comes from the computer screens nowadays, as far as, but, hey, way back in my day, we had to go to the hobby shops, and we would learn, and we took, we met friends there, and that we became a group of knit friends that we would all model railroad together, and we would work our way around to different layouts, and that's where we would learn the different skills. And so being able to put all that together, learning DCC is just one aspect of it. And I think that, again, this is my opinion, take it for what it's worth, I sell it for the same price, is that DCC is a technology that is not as complicated as it sounds, but a lot of people get, they tighten up as soon as they hear those words digital and stuff like that. And so one of the things I try to do is to share how all the stuff works, so that the technology doesn't sound quite as intimidating. And we've got a lot of videos on our YouTube channel, including what is DCC, where we break it down fundamentally in, layman's terms, to understand what's happening. There's one video that we did, webinar number 9, that literally teaches you how to use the 3 major DCC systems that are out there, because their manuals are crap. They don't really tell you very well how to use their product, and they're basically give you a manual, give you the system, take your money and go, well, thanks, good luck. And that's about the extent of their support. And so while using the Digitrax or the NCE or the MRC system isn't necessarily in our scope of things, because it's not our product, but that's the gateway. That's what allows you to use the decoder. And if you can't use the throttle, you're never going to get to be able to access the higher functions or the higher advanced features of the decoder. And so that's why I go on this crusade of trying to teach and share the education and share the knowledge, because once you understand how everything's happening on the rails, you become a lot less intimidated by it. And what's the term they always say? Knowledge is power.
Mm-hmm.
And right. So, that's one of the things that's kind of my crusade. And in the end, obviously, I want you to buy my products. But ultimately, we're all model railroaders, and so we all want to get the best out of it. And I joined SoundTraxx because I thoroughly believed in the product. And the guy I mentioned, my train club back in Texas, we were the Spring Creek Model Train Club. down in North Dallas. And the guys there used to accuse me of being on the payroll at SoundTraxx because my stuff worked. And I said, well, I run SoundTraxx. I don't know what the heck you guys are running. And they would always know my stuff ran. So they couldn't really argue, so to speak. It was, and then they would buy SoundTraxx. Said, and you might as well be on the payroll. So when I got laid off at my auto parts job, I thought, why not? So I nagged Nancy until she gave me a job, basically.
So, yeah, good point. A good point on those manuals, especially. So George, what was the antithesis? What was the spark going back to a young George, small boy? What got you into model railroading in the first place?
Well, into trains in general was kind of it was, I don't want to say it's in my blood, but it kind of was. And Jim, I apologize. I forgot. I was going to send you a picture to share, but I forgot about it. So it'll be a little late now. But I have a picture of me as like, I don't remember, 2 or 3 or 4. Dad had to train some trains that he had put on the table in the kitchen. He'd laid newspapers down because we didn't want to get the train oil on the table, and then put a section of, a loop of track of the old Atlas sectional track around and ran trains. And we had my grandfather's, or maybe it was my great grandfather, I don't remember. It was somebody's old Tyco Mantua 440, the General that they had built. And my mother inherited it from her family. Like I said, it was her father or her grandfather or something like that. And so we were running it around. And the pictures of me sitting there trying to carefully put it back on the track. And it's actually a really cool picture. If I get to a break here, I'll see how quickly I can find it and text it to you, Jim, so you can share it.
Yeah, definitely.
But so it's always been in there. My dad had some trains. We had a layout in the garage of, standard 4x8. We'd go to the toy store and buy the Tycos. I had the blue and yellow Virginians. What is it? The Alco C630.
I think so. Yeah.
My brother had the Tyco GM&O GP20. And those were our specific engines, and we would run them. But the train layout always became the universal dumping ground for everything when we were growing up. And it was like, Dad, can we play with trains? No, I don't really want to mess. I don't really want to feel like cleaning it off right now. So maybe next week, which I learned was, don't bother me right now. I just got home from work. So I never really got to do much with it. And so it kind of is out of sight, out of mind. Well, but the trains had always been interested with me and interest. And we lived in Arlington, Texas, actually, which is between Dallas, Fort Worth, and it's home to one of the major General Motors plants. Used to be the Buick Olds Pontiac. And so the Mopac yard that was outside of there used to be called BOP, which stood for Buick Olds Pontiac. But somewhere, I think it was like in the mid 90s, I want to say, they converted that whole plant to build GM trucks. And so all the GM trucks are built out of that Arlington plant in Arlington, Texas. Well, anyway, when I was growing up, the love of trains was always there. And some people may have heard this story. But I remember one time we were doing something, I'm probably 10 at this point. We did this thing called Safety Town. And Safety Town was a little plywood little town that was built up in a section of the mall right there across from the BOP yard. And it was run by the Arlington Police Department. And they basically would teach you how to do all the sign, traffic signs, basically, traffic safety, what the signs meant, how to handle that. And then they also taught you the road signs, because you're getting to that age now where you start to be interested. So you'd at least know what the stop sign meant, or the, own one way, do not enter, all that stuff. So there would be half of the class in each session would be walking and doing the walking stuff. And then the other half would be riding big wheels or bicycles around and that kind of stuff. And I just remember explicitly one time there was a train going by. So I'm over here rail fanning, riding along my big wheel, bam, hit the back of some kid. And I was so upset because they were like, "Oh, well, you hit somebody. Well, you have to get out." I was like, "But I was watching the train." That didn't matter. So I was so upset, and so I had to walk the rest of my session. So the love of trains has always been there. And then somewhere around 14, I had my own room now. Finally, I had, rekindled that love. My mother was going to the craft store at that time. It was Michael's, and we were walking through, and I wanted to go see the toy section, which, Michael's isn't exactly a toy section, but it was what it
Right.
was. But lo and behold, was that first Athearn Blue Box. It was a Southern Pacific 34-foot hopper kit for like $5 or $3 or whatever it was. And I was like, "Oh, Mom, can I have this?" "Oh, sure." So she bought me this kit, and little did she know what she was starting, because the love of trains had always been there, but I didn't have anywhere to do it and to play with it. And so I bought that and put it in, and I'd go out and get some of the sections of track that were still there and running it back and forth in my bedroom. And finally, I got permission to get a 4x6 piece of plywood and build one of those Atlas train sets, one of those Atlas layouts, and put it in my room because I didn't have room. And oh, actually, hold on. I don't know how well it's going to come through. I just remembered. Hold on. There it is.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
I was going to share these with it. Let's see how well it comes through. But there's my first 4x6 layout.
Oh, that's cool. That's really nice.
But what got me into the Mopac was, it went through town. And so we went back to Michael's one time, and they were having a train sale. And so I went through, and they were selling locomotives for $10, basically. Wow. And I remember seeing that they had the Athearn Blue Box, the new tooling GP38-2s at the time. And those are the ones that had like the fans where you could actually almost see the shape of the fan in through the grating and the detail.
Yep.
And I remember, and it was the Mopac blue. I was like, "Hey, wait, I recognize that paint scheme. That's the same ones that run over here." So Mom bought it for me, and that was kind of what started. And that was what was in the picture here as the lead on that train, was one of those old Athearn Blue Box. You can see it paired up there with a G50 behind it.
Yeah.
And so that was what kind of got me started in doing this. And so after that, I made friends with the local folks at the hobby shop. And some of those guys I'm still great friends with today. Talk about lifelong friendships and stuff. I'm something years old now. And we're still great friends. So that's been a good 35 year, friendship that's gone on all these years. And, and that's what I owe a lot of this to, is because these guys had learned it from somewhere. And so they brought me in and taught me how to do it. I built modules, joined modular layouts with them. I built, as you can see, my own layout. And that was a very crude layout, but it was the first one I actually got to call my own. And so, it's been an enjoyment. And so when I got to actually work in the industry, I'm like, I don't model itself per se on a daily basis. So it's separated enough that the hobby part of it and the sales part of it are separated enough that I don't really get burnt out.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of us in the industry, and we all talk at shows, and it can be pretty easy when you make your passion or your hobby, your work. And it does happen in the industry, unfortunately. But fortunately, I think model railroading is such a diverse hobby that it's kind of hard to suffer from the kind of burnout that we see in other industries. And I mean, prime example. I mean, you are usually on the road talking about SoundTraxx and all the products that you guys offer. But when you come home to work on the layout, you may be doing scenery, you may be doing track work, you may be doing. It's enough of a diversion. So that's a good point.
Yep, exactly. So that's kind of the history. And then when I really started getting into it, going out, living on my own, every apartment I had growing up had a layout in it. And so it's interesting. It's not exactly how shall we say it, the first topic you want to do on a date when you're going out with the ladies. And so when I met my wife, who's actually my second wife, but when I met my wife, I was very afraid to say anything because I dated several gals between my first wife, which never should have happened, which we're still friends. So, I mean, we just never should have been married.
Okay.
But so when I met my wife, I was like very afraid to say anything about it, and it kind of came up in one of our first conversations. And finally, I was like, "Oh well, I have model trains in my garage." And she was like, "Oh really? What scale? My dad does that." Holy
Wow.
crap! So it was
Wow.
like she'd been groomed to be my wife her whole life.
Right. That's funny you say that because I too I'm on my second marriage and hopefully my last. And I never told my wife that I was in the model trains. Now, ironically, both my wife and I worked in the hobby industry, but at the time I was a marketing person for model airplanes. And so, as a marketing person for model airplanes, you were doing that pretty much nonstop. The trains are kind of over there. And it wasn't until years later that, she's like, "You're into trains?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm also into Star Trek too. So if you want to see other guys, I get it." And she was the same way. She's like, "Oh no, I think trains are cool." And to this day, she is a huge supporter of my hobby. And it's nice, to have wives that are supportive of the hobby. She's not one of those ones you see in the old comics that's mad that a new train comes in. If I order something, whether it be through work or through one of our hobby retailers, she's more curious about, oh, what's this? What's it going to do? That kind of thing. So
Hmm.
that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely,
So,
and they're invaluable to have,
oh yeah,
because
absolutely.
I have good friends of mine I have a friend of mine in Louisiana who's I've been doing kind of side work for years, even long before I donned the purple shirt. And his lady won't let him keep any trains in the house, so his layout is actually outside under the deck out back, and so when weather hits, he can't run trains.
Oh, that's terrible.
So you
Wow.
take your blessings when you can get them.
Absolutely.
So
Wow. Um, a lot of us have been following you on YouTube. You've got a YouTube channel about your layout, and
mhm.
that too, that's built in a garage, but you've got a really nice setup in your garage. Tell us a little
Cur-
bit about your home layout.
so my wife and I actually just moved about a year and some change ago. October or August of sorry April of 23 we moved in. And so when I had the old house, I was forced to a 20-foot straight segment. That was all the room in that garage.
Wow.
And I didn't even want to put it in any of the bedrooms because the bedrooms were fairly small. And
Okay.
so I would be forced to either have like a 20-inch radius, or I would be having basically a giant loop that went around because, you know, we all know the wider the radius, the better the equipment runs.
Sure.
And it looks certainly a whole lot better.
Oh yeah.
And so I've adopted on my personal layout, minimum yard is 6 turnout, main lines are 8s, and turns, no
Mm.
matter where they are 36.
Oh wow. Nice.
So if you're talking about a 10-foot wide room, 36-inch radius doesn't give you much yard space.
No.
So I didn't even want to bother. Plus, it was a temporary place. We were just renting. Because when we moved up here, it was a change. It was a culture change for me. I was doing something completely different. They're taking a chance on somebody who's a hobbyist, that I may show up here and just think I'm playing with trains all day long, and then just piddle my thumbs waiting to play with trains all day long and not sell anything. Um, so it was kind of a double gamble. So we rented the place, but it ended up turning out to be like unlike Jimmy McMillan of the 2016 presidential race, the rent was too damn cheap to move out. So we stayed there forever. And finally the landlord was like, "Hey, I'm going to sell this. I'm done. I'm getting out of it." Okay, fine.
Mm.
So we bought a house. So we moved on in April of 23. And of course, my first tasks were getting the house cleaned up and fixed. Now, this is where I'll say model railroading actually comes in handy. You talk about the world's greatest hobby. I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
have the carpentry skills I have now without model railroading. I wouldn't
Yep.
be able to go in and do pipe work or replace a kitchen sink or any of that type of stuff without any of those hands-on things that, okay, I've know how all this stuff kind of goes together. I'm going to look at a project and figure it out.
Right.
So I spent a lot of time doing that. Well, in September, I was kind of getting settled in and saying, all right, well, I've got most of the stuff done that I need to get done, the honeydews. So we're moved in. We've got most of the things unboxed. There's still a few boxes here and there. But for the most part, we're settled in. All right. You know what? I've got a whole giant 2-car garage now that not only houses 2 cars, but is an additional 4 feet wider than the doors and 4 to 6 feet deeper than it was. So my 20-foot layout was dwarfed in this garage. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. So I decided to start expanding. So I did. So I built a little bit extension on the end of the yard so I could have some more cars and stash them over there and do a little bit better sorting. Because as it was, I couldn't fit a whole 6-car train in my yard because of my minimums. My yard is 6.5 feet long at the old place with number 6 turnouts and a runaround. It takes up a lot of space. Sure. And so the yard tracks, the shortest yard track was only a couple of feet long, which doesn't mean much. So I had to build the train on multiple tracks. So expanded that, was like, oh, well, now I've got this whole back wall now that things are cleaned up. So I built a 14.5-foot L-shaped extension to get me around the corner. And now I moved one section over to the far wall. And now I had a run between the yard and the industrial area. And that's not where it stopped. And so I keep expanding. And I've been posting the updates on my YouTube channel, which is known as Goalie George, one word, GoalieGeorge. And you can go on YouTube and watch the updates. I think the last update was in the beginning of August, where I'd done some updates and stuff like that. But I haven't done much since. Just because with some travel fit in there. My friend Louisiana's got me doing some work for him. So I've been focusing on getting his stuff done because that's paying for my vacation coming up here in a few weeks. So I was like, all right, I'll do that work and get that done. So I haven't done much, but I've been doing some operating and it certainly is a lot more fun now with more space. And starting in May, I started a new 8-foot by 2-foot extension that includes 3 more industries, including a scrapyard, oil facility, and a team track.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's so cool to watch your progress. And for those that are watching the live or watching afterwards, if you want to see more of George's layout, his link is in the video description below. You can go see his layout. Also, we've got a link down there too for SoundTraxx because winter's coming. I know a lot of guys have projects coming, and that's the time to start doing some of those projects, some of those locomotives to give them some upgrades like a Tsunami 2, get some lighting effects in there, something that George is famous for. You've done a lot of work. Yeah, that Jeep behind you, that's an Athearn Genesis that you modified to have the class lights and I believe the number boards too, right?
I didn't do the number boards on this one. That's on the schedule, but I added the truck lights so you can kind of see a little bit of a glow right there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You can kind of see that. So I added those. The reason I didn't do the number boards on this particular one is because drilling that out and then fitting a piece of styrene ×4, because you want to use the clear styrene so the light comes through it. Sure. I didn't really feel like doing it at that point in time, so I left the number boards off. But now I'm going back and lighting all my number boards, so I'm cursing myself for not fixing that one.
But there's always a project. That's the thing with model railroading. There's always a project, and it's, again, going back to what you were saying earlier, and you're right. I think that's one of the reasons why my wife loves the hobby so much is because I got into woodworking, because of building, layouts, building modules, building that kind of stuff. Before, I couldn't build a square box with plywood to save my life. Now, I've gotten a lot better. So woodworking skill is something I've learned. Wiring, electrical skills. There's so many skills with model railroading that you can take into our other aspects of our lives. Whereas other hobbies, it's either fishing, bowling, it's pretty much just that thing. Whereas model railroading, we get to do it all. And, my wife really likes another aspect of model railroading, and that's research. When you want to see how the prototype goes, you get in the car, you bring your camera, you bring your maps, and you go. And it makes a nice outing for the day. If you are a nice husband and you put some antique stores in there too, that always helps. But it's just a great family activity for young and old.
A great place to stop for lunch.
Yes, you've got some great places on your layout to stop for lunch, and
I do.
I will let you know if you have not seen George's layout. George and I guess it's no secret we're car guys too. I mean, you grew up by the General Motors plant. I'm kind of a Ford guy, and we have our own cars, so you still have room for your beauty in the garage along with the layout.
Correct.
How do the cars influence you on your layout? And hopefully we get some people to check out your layout because you get some great scenes on your layout.
Yeah, well, one of the things we've talked about is the cars, in my opinion, set the era. I mean, you can have models out there and the trains, but I mean, realistically, you and I both know the grain cars, for example, haven't really changed much since the 60s.
Right.
When they started doing the 4427s and the 4750s, and then the 4650 center flows, for almost 40, 50 years, they haven't really changed much. So they don't really set the era as much. I mean, the equipment, the locomotives can, but even there, you can find GP7s, GP9s running today. So the cars really help set it. So, I had always bought cars because I grew up in an era where the cars were blobs of plastic with wheels on them that you might be able to, put on there and make it look okay. I mean, do you remember the old Magnuson cars that you used to get?
Yeah.
They were the cast resin that was just a blob, the shaped like, I remember, because at the time I was working at the independent parts store, auto parts store. And one of the guys there had restored a 67 Camaro. And so Magnuson came out with this 67 Camaro kit. It was this blob of resin that you had the metal wheels you would glue onto the side. And then when you glued them on the side and you painted it up, the sort of clear resin would give you some illusion of an interior.
Right.
So they weren't really great. But as we started getting more of the die cast, you could see not Pricer. You had Viking. You had Viking. You had Revell was one. Remember the Revell kits? Yeah. They started putting them out. They were like, what, $5? It was fantastic.
Yeah, and they were mass retail too for a while.
Yeah, and then you could get like fresh cherries at the Walmart.
Yep.
And stuff. And so I started buying a bunch of those type of things. But now when I started working at SoundTraxx, when I travel, I can't always buy everything I want to. So I would start buying cars because I can fit those in my backpack or in my suitcase without taking up too much space. Because when I'm traveling doing shows, sometimes I have to carry my trade show equipment in my suitcase along with my clothes, my toiletries, and other necessities. Because obviously nowadays you can't travel with anything like a razor on the airplane.
Right.
So,
right.
But anyway, so I would collect cars. Well, when I'm building this layout, I was looking at the expansion now, and I was like, well, I want something that I can show off some of the cars. And what's better than a nice urban scene that has a lot of parking lots? Right. And also I have, being a Texas boy, I have my affinity for Whataburger and some Waffle House and some of the other good eats like that. And so I was like, well, let's see what's out there. And a few years ago it was the Red River RPM down in Fort Worth, Texas that I went to. I met a guy there and he had a Whataburger 3D print. I was like, oh my God, I've got to have this. And I said, he said, how much? I asked him how much. He told me. I was like, do you want it now? He's like, no. When are you going to St. Louis? I said, yes, I'm going to St. Louis. He says, I'll bring you one in St. Louis. He brought it to me in St. Louis. I paid him the money. I haven't seen him since.
Oh, wow.
I haven't. I mean, it's one of those just rare moon events.
Wow.
Now, he may have been at shows, but I don't always get around anymore because as the popularity of our products grow and things like that, my ability to walk around becomes a little less frequent. I mean, you and I were paired next to each other at St. Louis RPM show. I think during the show, we said two sentences to each other. Hey, I'm going to the bathroom. Can you watch this? Or, hey, I'm getting a beverage. Do you want something?
Right. And like the
So
good Texan that you are, you brought me back a Dr. Pepper.
I did. So so anyway, my point being was then, so it's like, okay, when I'm looking at this expansion, I need to incorporate that Whataburger, even though technically I'm modeling Missouri.
Okay.
So I was trying to fit it in there. I wanted to put a grocery store. I wanted to put this, our friend Per Larson of Summit Customs makes some amazing laser cut styrene kits. And they basically fall together, and there are a lot of modern buildings. He has, I think, 3 or 4 versions of a Taco Bell. He's got a Walmart. He's got a Lowe's. He's got Holiday Inn. He's got Denny's. And they're all just laser cut plastic kits that he built for his own layout, which is amazing in itself. And he uses SoundTraxx products. And anyway, so I wanted to buy this Waffle House kit from him. So I bought the Waffle House kit. So I needed a place to put it. So I'm figuring out, how am I going to get roads in this area and put the buildings that I want without it looking like it's a model railroad. And what I mean by that is, we as modelers want to see the fronts of buildings. And so unrealistically, we'll have the track, the road right next to it, and then the building facing the road. Right. And we're fitting the front of the building in such a way that it doesn't look like it would be prototypical. Because normally in that scenario, that would be an alleyway. We would see the backs of the buildings, and the actual road would be facing away from us.
Right.
So, but that doesn't give us what we want, because we want to see the building kit we just put together. So I was playing around with a whole different ways. I realized I was trying to fit in too much. And so I kind of compromised, and I did a road crossing the railroad tracks with buildings on the 4 corners, kind of showing it off and highlighting the building, so you can see the building kit. And the Waffle House technically is the back of the building, but I've got it angled in such a way that you see most of it. So with my detailed and lit interiors, which of course I have to do, you can still appreciate and see it. So so anyway, I've got parking lots filled with cars, and I still have several boxes of cars that are unused. But all I keep thinking about is that Vic Smith layout we went to go see in St. Louis, the City's Edge. It's been in many magazines. He's got cars galore, and he makes me look like an amateur when it comes to car collecting.
I gotta ask, you've got a C4 Corvette?
Yeah.
Have you got one in HO to match?
Yes.
Excellent.
But it's not on the layout, because my layout's 1978.
Yeah, that would be a futuristic car if you put that on there. That's cool.
Yep. There is one on there, but it's hidden.
It's hidden. It's like the DeLorean.
Yeah, so you can see it if you look for it, but it's hidden.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The cars, the trucks, the trailers, the advertisements, they really do set the era for the layout. Because let's be honest, I mean, if we have somebody, especially if we're at a show, I know a lot of us out there, myself included, do a modular version of railroading. And, we're going to have public people coming in, and they don't know BNSF from Santa Fe. They don't know Mopac from Union Pacific. They just know what they know. And when they look at your layout, when they look at your module, and they say, oh, well, hey, you know what? That's a 76 Gremlin. I had one of those in college. Or, that's a 72 Eldorado. My dad had one of those. Suddenly it fits. It's kind of like watching an old television show. And it's subtle, but it's a great tool. I've also found, too, like trailers, kind of set that era, too. The advertisements on the trailers, not to mention the actual size of the trailers.
Oh, yeah.
Like your layout, you wouldn't have 53-foot trailers. You would have, at the most, maybe a 45-foot trailer.
Yep. Well, I even go back to, the first time I bought one of these. Mm-hmm. There it is. One of those engines, going back to that visit to Michael's. Hey, I recognize this paint scheme. That's the same that runs right there. It's that same analogy, or the
connection.
There you go.
Yeah.
Familiarity, I think, was the word I was trying to find.
Yeah, and that's what really draws that person in. And that's what I like about your layout. The trains are part of the story, but they're certainly not the only part of the story. They're telling everything else is kind of drawing you in, and the trains are the main action part of it. And you do a lot of operations too. The last video I saw on your channel, you talked a little bit about operations.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like you've been getting into that a lot heavier in the last year or two now that you've got some room for your layout.
Certainly now with more expansion space, absolutely. I've been in operations a long time, which is why, you know, kind of drawing back to SoundTraxx a little bit, is I keep pushing the cool features we built into there because we spend so much time trying to create a realistic scene. I mean, aside from this white building right here, which was a placeholder, I mean, you could almost look at that and think that was 1978. I mean,
Oh yeah,
even down to the guy's sideburns.
Oh yeah. He does
And
have
so,
some.
but so we spend our time trying to make a realistic environment for our trains, but then we run them like slot cars. And so, start, stop, and no brakes, no anything. Just I need to stop right there. But and so that's why I try to promote a lot of the features that we built into the decoder, because quiet. I mean, closeted. Every one of us want to be a railroad engineer at some point. Whether we admit it verbally or not, we all want to run a real train.
Sure.
And so this is the closest simulation you can get, because anybody can make a noisemaker. But we try to put a lot of the sounds into there where they're interactive. So for example, when you use your brakes more frequently, well, in the real world, you're depleting the air reservoir, which means the governor kicks on the air compressor to recharge up the train line. And so all of our sounds work interactively. And that's where the operations for me really comes into play, is because we can kind of quietly become that railroad engineer that we really want and be able to use all the sounds and features of the decoder to run our train. And so when it comes to operations, I'm really pushing that. And that's why I have some operation videos on there, including there's one video that I posted about, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe no, now that I'm thinking about it, now that's longer than that, probably 7 years ago. But anyway, I was going to I was planning to go to the Mopac Historical Society meet, and I had to bail. And so they said, well, I know we had you signed up for a clinic, so can you do it in a video? Sure. So I did a video, posted it on my YouTube channel, and then they never played it. I was like, well, okay. So anyway, there's a video on there on how I kind of go through and do a lot of the setup of my operations using Tsunami 2, where you can actually go in and learn the features of it and how to operate, including something called power braking.
Right.
Where the Mopac, because they had non-dynamic brake equipped models, as evidenced right there, they would do power braking. They would throw the engine into notch 8, and the engines would notch up and start pulling the train, but then they would set the automatic. And the reason for that was because they would pull the couplers tight, because even on the slightest grade or whatever, they didn't have the slack bunching up or the train doing this as it's backing, coming to a stop. So the train was pulling as the locos were pulling as the trains were slowing to a stop. Well, I can do that properly through the decoder. And so by doing the operations, now I can be that railroad engineer that I always wanted to be at some point. But now I'm doing it in model form, so I don't have to get my hands dirty, and I don't have to climb around and spend weeks and months away from home.
Right.
And so the operations, it's not just running trains around in a circle, which if you enjoy that, great, more power to you. That's one of the beauties of our hobby, is everybody can have what they like to do in our hobby. If you like just running trains in circles, great, you can do that. If you want to run your trains more realistically, great, you can do that. If you're somewhere in between, great, you can do that. You can set up as much or as little of our decoders as you desire. And that's one of the things that we've done with your R&D partners, our staff, is that you guys have decided how much of that you want to implement and what changes you want to make to the decoder for your models, and we certainly can comply with that, with what you desire. But as the end user, you can put all of this in there. You can use none of it. You can use some of it. It's up to you entirely. But when it comes to the operation of the layout, my layout is really small for an operation. So I look at it as a branch line off of the White River route. And the White River route comes out of Kansas City, heads down south through Missouri, up into northern Arkansas, and intersects with the the Little Rock to St. Louis line just north of Little Rock called Diaz Junction. And that's the White River line. So I'm modeling a fictional kind of a branch industrial line out of Carthage, Missouri, because I'm not modeling anything specific out of Carthage. I'm just kind of throwing some vignettes of it, so to speak. I'm calling it Missouri. Eventually, my big layout that I plan once I have and hit the lottery to be able to build a building behind will be a 25 by 25 mushroom style double deck layout that will be the White River line. So for now, it's just a small industrial. So train lengths are basically 6 cars and a caboose and 1 to 2 locomotives. So that way our train lengths are manageable. Basically gives us something to do, something to play with. We can run the trains from the yard to the industrial area, do some work, come back. And I haven't done everything, so I can send a second train over there to do the work, or I can send one past the first industrial area now to the new industrial area where I've got the scrap yard and whatnot to pass them and keep 3 people busy, 1 in the yard, 1 in the industrial, and 1 on the new section. And I've personally converted everything on the layout to Blue Nami for multiple reasons, not the least of which is the fact that now I can run my trains at home the same way, whether I take them on the road and run them on your layout, or run them on a club layout, or run them, say, for example, next time I go to Southern California, I'll probably get a chance to run trains on La Mesa because I'm really good friends with a lot of people there. So, and I've done that, and you can see a video of that running on my YouTube channel as well. So therefore, I don't have to learn their system, and I also don't have to deal with the limitations of their system. For example, there was one train club in the Midwest that we visit usually once a year, and I'll leave it at that. And we were doing a presentation at their club, and we shown off, I think it was sound car at this point. We said, here, take it to the layout and go play with it. Well, we put it over there, and the guy brought his train over, and then he went to blow the horn. It took 3 seconds for that honk to blow. And what that told me was, oh my God, how much DCC traffic is going through that line on this massive club layout to cause a 3-second delay.
Wow.
And so those are some of the limitations that you might find at club layouts. So my first recommendation to them was obviously reset the system, but this was a massive club. So they have things like routes, and they also used the memory of the command station to build their consists, which was another issue, because now that's occupying memory slots, command slots, and the advanced consisting that they thought they were using wasn't a true advanced consist, because only the lead unit was getting the sounds, which is why the braking wasn't working. And that's part of why a lot of people don't use a lot of the better features of the decoders, because they get locked into these consisting methods that don't send any function commands to the trailing units. And so rather than go learn advanced consisting, SoundTraxx YouTube channel, webinar 14. So instead of going and learning all that, they just, well, I can run my train and I'll just live with it the way it is. And that's fine. But if you want, you guys are out buying the best decoder out there. I mean, you can see the sign here, Model Railroaders Reader's Choice Award winner twice for favorite sound decoder. You're buying the best decoder out there. You're buying Athearn products with the best decoders. And so you want to take advantage of all those features, but your DCC system, again, is going to be your limitation. And so that's part of why I've been putting Blue Nami in, not because I don't know the DCC system at home, but now anybody who comes over to run trains can download the app on their phone and be running my trains in a matter of seconds, as opposed to having to teach them the DCC throttle, how to access the higher functions. The Blue Nami has everything labeled out, so I don't have to guess or remember function 14 is switching mode, and function 22 is my class lights, let's say, and 28 is this. It's labeled right there for them, so they don't have to guess at it. It's right there. But that's why I've done that on my personal home layout, but then, and on my personal models. But then if somebody comes over and they just feel more comfortable with the DCC system, the Blue Nami is a DCC decoder. They grab a throttle and just start running a train, and and go from there. So
You know, that's the beauty of SoundTraxx. I mean, when I first came to work for Athearn, you know, I had Athearn equipment before that, but it's really when you delve into it deep, especially with, say, a Genesis model. So for those that don't know, when an Athearn product developer picks, we'll say, you know, a certain Genesis locomotive, and they are going to pick the prime mover sound. They're going to pick, you know, if that's got a Leslie horn, they're going to use a Leslie horn. They're going to use either an electronic bell. In some cases, there's different types of bells. You know, a CNW gong bell is going to sound different than, say, a bell, an electronic bell on a modern BNSF unit. All of those little things on a Genesis locomotive, those are sounds that the researcher puts in their write-up, and it goes to SoundTraxx, and SoundTraxx builds those in Colorado, sends them to our factory. And this is what I love about it, George, because SoundTraxx and the technology allows me to do so much more with my trains now. Because not only do we have that sound, which really, I don't care who you are, the sound draws you in. Not just the prime mover, not just the horn, not just the bells, but the brake sounds, the compressor sound, the air sounds, all of that makes it that much better. But what's really cool is I can change anything I want. You know, if I don't think that Leslie chime is just right, in most cases, the SoundTraxx decoder has 3 different versions of that same horn. So you can go in there and change it to your heart's content. You can, you know, change the sounds. I'm in a very small room, so usually the factory settings that come from the factory are way too loud. So I can turn all of those settings down. Not only can I do a master volume, but I can have the prime mover at one level, I can have the horn at another level, I can have the bell at another level. It's that adaptable. And now we're introducing the Blue Nami technology, which is just a huge game changer. Because like you were saying, you don't have to worry about, okay, what's the Wi-Fi here? Okay, how do I do this? How do I do that? You don't have to worry about that. It's a Bluetooth connection. It's on your phone. And the thing I really like about Blue Nami is you don't have to push buttons the old-fashioned way to adjust CVs and all of that. It's plain as day right there in front of you. I've seen you talk about it at shows, and I've seen you operate with Blue Nami, and really, it just makes the hobby that much more fun.
Well, it takes the complexity out of it because,
Right.
you know, let's just look at one of them. Okay, CV114, and I'm bringing this up specifically for a reason. CV114 has several factors into it, one of which is how many speed steps per notch the diesel engine changes. One of them is what's called interlock. Our decoders have auto notching, which as you increase the throttle or whatever, it'll up and down. But it also allows you a manual override. So you can do an RPM plus and an RPM minus. And what the interlock does, it prevents you from accidentally shutting down your prime mover while your locomotive is still moving. So let's say you were coasting into a station, but you wanted to be at idle. So you hit RPM minus a couple of times. Oops, I forgot I was only in notch 2. Now I'm shutting my prime mover down. The interlock prevents that. It also addresses how the dynamic brakes are applied on your locomotive, whether the prime mover drops to idle, because typically you're not running the diesel engine at full speed if you're braking. You know, it'd be the same as pushing your accelerator in your car while you're holding the brakes down. And then there's some that go to notch 4, some to notch 8. There's a lot of different settings on it. But the reason I brought up CB114 is because the auto start. This is one of the things I get a lot of questions on, because from the factory and the Athearn models themselves, also, once you put it on the track, the sound powers up. Well, one of the other brands out there has chosen to do it differently, and that's fine. But what happened is people are like, well, how do I turn that off? I've had people actually tell me, I'd love to buy your decoders. Everything about them sounds better. They're more functionality, but I got to turn off the auto, that start. And my first question then is, you don't think that's a setting? And so that lives in CV114. So when you go through the manual, you have to combine all these bits together to determine how you tell the decoder to behave. With Blue Nami, first thing I go is prime mover. There's a list there, and I don't have one connected in front of me, so I can't show it to you on my phone. But it says number of speed steps per notch. Click it. and it pulls down a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You click whatever you want it to do. All right, done. That's changed CV114 behind the scenes. You just don't realize it. Right. Then there's another one. Do you want to enable the auto start or disable it? Click, done. Do you want to enable the interlock or not? Click, done. All of those settings are changing CV114. They're just doing it behind the scenes. And that's where Bluenami really, comes into play, because the programming is a lot easier. You're not messing with bits. Your control is your throttle. It's your phone. So chances are, in a 3-hour operating session, the battery on your phone is going to last the entire 3 hours. The Bluenami also is paired to your phone, so you don't have to worry about somebody coming along in the DCC throttle and accidentally having the same locomotive on a club layout, let's say, because that happens a lot, especially with like a big boy 4014 or, any of the other mass produced models. Let's look at one of the things I was going to ask you, Jim. Where are my G15s?
It's coming November.
Good to know.
I too am waiting for that same one. Yep. But
the G15s are coming out, and there's 3 Mopac models. So if I come home and I put them on my layout, okay, great, no problem. But if I go to a club where somebody else models Missouri Pacific, let's say I lived in St. Louis, and there's a lot of Mopac modelers there. Let's take Mike Buddy, for example. You've got all these models that can be the same road numbers on the same club layout. Well, as much as we would love DCC to be bulletproof and foolproof, it's not. And so when, let's say, Jim, you brought your Mopac G15 1657, I think, or 1658 is one of the numbers that you're doing. You go home, but in your haste, you didn't necessarily release it off your throttle. You just unplugged your throttle, went home. Well, the DCC system still has it in the queue, because even if that command is speed step 0, forward, no motion, turn off all your functions, it's still an active command. That's the kind of stuff that leads to those delays we were talking about earlier. Right. Well, then I come into the club and I'm happy. I just bought my new Mopac GP15s and I plug in my throttle, put on the track, and my locomotive's sitting here doing this. What's wrong with the engine? Absolutely nothing, because the commands have 2 sets of commands going to my locomotive. One telling it to run at speed step 20, the other's telling it to stop because you didn't clear your throttle properly. And so that's where a lot of this behind the scenes stuff comes up into play. And so let's just even take, for example, there was one time I went to La Mesa and run with one of your fellow employees out there, Mr. Yoder. I was running trains with him and I said, well, what do you have as guest consist numbers? He's like, oh, just plug it in the system. The system will assign it. And I went, nope, not doing that. So I went and put my locomotives on the track in the consist I had built at the hotel room. Ran my train, ran fine, came back down. And when I went to say goodbye, he was up on the mezzanine level on the phone. And I went up to say goodbye because I was heading back to LA to part. So that was an hour and some change drive at 11:30 at night, but I'm a night owl anyway. Anyway, I get up to the top and I talk to him. I happen to look down. Oh, lo and behold, in this yard at his foot was the same locomotive that I had built into my consist. And so I point that out because if I had built the consist the way he told me to, that locomotive would have been running up there in that section of layout unattended. Who knows if it had derailed, flipped a switch, caused a short, caused a meltdown, or, worse, damaged something. And so I was like, that's exactly why you don't just randomly assign consist numbers, especially when a guest is bringing something in. Right. There's one layout I think I've taken you to in Colorado, John Parker's BNSF layout.
Yes, beautiful.
If anybody brings anything over, consist address 3, because he uses advanced consisting. So if I bring something over to run trains, I have to use address 3. Because he's built all those consists, and that's exactly why the multiple numbers comes into play. So when you're using the Bluenami, because it's paired to your device, you don't have to worry about somebody else stealing your locomotive or putting their 3985 or their 4014 on the layout, because I'm not using the DCC signal. I'm using the track for power. I'm using my app. So you can have 6 people on the same layout, all running 4014s. And you know what? If they're all Bluenami, nobody's having any cross-contamination of the signals.
Right. I mean, that's the beauty of it. I mean, as long as you were telling me, I think St. Louis, as long as there's track power, you're good to go. In fact, that brings up another good point about Bluenami is, you've been doing some, I believe it was ON30 that is dead rail, correct? ON3.
ON3.
Okay.
I have a RGS 41 that's a brass precision scale model
Hmm.
that, man, you want to talk about having the right friends. I had a friend of mine gift that to me.
Oh, wow.
Now, to be fair, he inherited it from a friend that his that passed away. He already had a 41, so he gave it to me to run, trying to get me into ON3. And it kind of worked, but I don't have the room for an ON3 layout right now. So maybe once I build that building out in the back of the property and then move my HO stuff out there, then I can put an ON3 layout where my HO layout is now.
Nice.
But anyway, point being is it's complete dead route. Onboard battery, there's an on-off switch and a plug for a port to charge it. So whenever I run it, I just charge it up, open up the app, turn on the locomotive, click, I'm connected, and I'm running on my tabletop. I'm running on dead rail, and I'm actually going to be in Pittsburgh next week for the narrow gauge convention, and I'm bringing that with me. So if any of your viewers happen to be in Pittsburgh and want to come to the narrow gauge convention, there's some fantastic modeling there. There's going to be a lot of great vendors and stuff to see and layout tours, but I'll have my stuff on display, and I'll have that ON3 RGS 41 that, of course, you know me, I had to light it up. So it's got firebox light, cab light, and red and green class lights.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I mean, for me anyways, you know, the SoundTraxx decoders have opened up a whole new world of model railroading. Now, as you know, and a lot of people know, I converted over to the proto throttle a number of years ago after operating a few EMDs at our local museum. You know, suddenly the dial thing wasn't doing it for me anymore. And because of the technology that is put into Tsunami and Econami decoders, whether it be HO or N scale, we can mimic the physics, if you will, of a full scale locomotive by programming different things into our locomotives, and we can assign. That's the great thing I love about DCC is mapping things. It's not just pushing a button to make a light come on. You can map what button or what switch is going to turn on your classification lights, your headlights, your ditch lights, things of that nature. And it goes back to that whole thing about talking about the realism that's drawing you in. And you know, in the old days with the old the blocks and wiring and stuff, we just couldn't do that. The consisting, we couldn't do that. And you know, it's a great time to be a model railroader with all this technology at our hands.
Absolutely. And that's what's great. I remember running my first DC modular layout. We had to make sure only one person was on the outer loop and one person was on the inner loop, no matter how big the layout was. But with DCC, we could have 3 people operating on each loop so that people watching the trains weren't bored waiting for the train to come on. There was always another train coming, and it was up to us to make sure we didn't run into each other's back end. But really opened up the door for that. And yeah, because the other thing is in those modular layouts, you run the risk of DC if you cross the gap and go into another block that somebody else takes over your train, and you're like, whoa, hold on, I got to stop. The DCC, and especially now with the Blue NAMI, I'm wirelessly connected through the Bluetooth connection. And one thing I real quick want to say is the Bluetooth connection is not your standard headphone connections. This is actually using called Bluetooth Low Energy. We advertise up to 100 foot of range, but the technology actually will go about 145, 150 foot. There's a video on our SoundTraxx YouTube channel where we do a range test, and we went 144 foot, and then that 145th foot, we lost connection. It's the same connection as anybody with those same smartwatches or Fitbits or whatever. So I've had somebody come over and say, well, we've outlawed Blue NAMI in our club. And this was like less than 3 months after it had been released. I was like, okay, this ought to be good. Tell me why. Well, it interferes with the radio throttles. I was like, no, it doesn't, because the Bluetooth technology has 37 channels that it channel surfs. So if it starts broadcasting on a channel and there's interference, it jumps to another channel. I said, if you're going to outlaw Blue NAMI, you see that smartwatch on your wrist right there? You need to outlaw that too, because that's using the same technology as my Blue NAMI. He was like, oh, yeah. So you guys probably, and then I got out of him that I found out he was at a show, and there were 2 other clubs, one on either side of his layout, all using NCE wireless throttles too. And it couldn't possibly have been that. It had to be the Blue NAMI decoder that one person was using. So
Yeah, I mean the technology that's packed into these is on a different level than what they're using. So one thing I do want to talk about briefly too, and it's something that we hear the Athearn team hears a lot at shows, is the sound of SoundTraxx. And people think that this is just manufactured in a room somewhere, kind of like what I think of modern music, and that's not the case. You guys actually have high tech equipment. You go to record all of the sounds.
mhm.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So when we go out and get new recordings, we actually contract with the railroad or the museum or whatever it is that has the equipment that we need to record. We need to make sure it's running and in good condition. And so we'll travel out there. We'll bring all of our mics. We'll bring our recording devices, and then of course extra things. And then there's mounts that we have to, poles, microphone poles,
Sure.
clamps, things like that. All that has to be brought with us because we're talking things like C clamps or angle clamps or whatever, zip ties to hold the cable up because you don't want a cable dangling and accidentally roll under the wheel.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of that type of stuff. Headphones to listen to the recording while it's happening to make sure you're not clipping the microphone, because depending on how and where you place the microphone may dictate whether you get a good or bad recording. Um, because you're talking about a lot of decibels coming out of there, because
Right.
it's the aftermath of an explosion basically. And
Sure.
so there's a lot of air pressure coming out, and that's what decibels are, is air pressure that our ears interpret as sound. um, and so putting the microphone up on various locations, you want the mic kind of up and pointed at, but not directly above. You want it around the locomotive in various locations. But we'll actually mic it up in several locations. And then we also contract with the railroad to make sure we have the ability to pull a train, because the locomotive, while you record it light, you go through the notches. Well, in that case, we wouldn't ever need to leave the yard. We can just go record anything,
Right.
but you want to record it under a load so that way you can get some good throaty parts to those diesel engines or that deeper chuff with the exhaust chuff of a steam engine. And when we're doing it with a steam engine, we actually work with the engineer to adjust the cutoff so we can get different recordings of even just the exhaust chuff. Um, but it is a reciprocating engine, so it's chuff 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 chuff. There's that timing, and you get it, but you want it at different intensities and different rates because, with the recording, the way that the decoder plays the algorithm, you may not have the time to play a full exhaust chuff if you're recording it slow at like 2 miles an hour, because it might be chuff chuff, but you may not have that time, especially if you're running the model, say it's speed step 25, where it's and so we record the chuffs at different speeds. We record the chuffs under different loads and with different timbers and cutoffs and things like that to make sure we get
Mm.
all the recordings that we need. And when it comes to the diesel engines, of course, there's different recordings and so forth. And we'll record it in all 8 notches, pulling that train all the way up and all the way down. So we get all the transitions from notch 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, whatever, all the way up and down throughout the entire speed range, including several startup and shutdown. We'll do this, and just to get a diesel recording, you may only need, we'll say for argument's sake, 8 seconds. A second for each notch, plus each transition, plus each startup and shutdown sequence. But you get about 30 minutes of audio recording, because then our trained audio engineers will go back in and they'll listen to that recording of, say, notch 5. And what they're doing is they're looking through there to find places where they can loop it, where you and I will never hear it, because if you and I can hear it, it
Mm.
ruins the illusion.
Sure.
And so when we're in notch 5, what you're hearing is probably about a second, 3/4 of a second audio clip that's played over and over again. And the shorter the clip, the better, the more reactive the decoder will be, because
Okay.
now when I transition up, you don't have to wait for that 3-second clip to play, for example, before the next
Ah,
audio recording is seamed in there.
sure.
And so our trained audio engineers have to go in and do those recordings and make it to where, say, notch 5 transition
Uh huh.
seamless with the notch 5 recording, both up and down. You want to make sure that those recordings are seamless, because otherwise, if we hear that clip or that change from one recording to the next, then it ruins the illusion.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but when we're going to recording, we actually record several different locomotives. We'll record several different places on the locomotive, including air compressor, traction motors, the outside crankcase, and things like that, because we want to make sure that we're getting a realistic, true effect of actually what it would be outside that locomotive. And the interesting thing with audio tools and audio is there's also a certain level of power suggestion. And I bring it up not because we do that per se. There's not necessarily that, but there's other companies out there that will talk about, oh, well, we have 6 versions of this GP38. Well, maybe, but maybe not, because I can take the same locomotive, put a mic on, like, let's use this locomotive behind me here. I can put a mic here and mount it and point it towards the exhaust stack, and I'm going to get one recording. Then I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to record the same locomotive. And I'm trying to do this as straight as I can, and I'm failing miserably, but I could do that over here and point the mic and get a different recording. And then I can come all the way over here to the front of the locomotive and go up and point the mic and get a whole different recording. And and so I can then get 3 completely different recordings, or I could even get one recording, go back in the audio and hear 3 different loopings of the same diesel engine and slice those up. And power suggestion tells you, yes, I went out and have 6 different versions. But rather than going out and faking that or telling you that we've got all these different versions, we do have several versions of some diesel engines, don't get me wrong, but we could very well just go in and cut a different section of that loop and create a third GP38-2, or we could go in and play with the audio tools. We could add a little bit of bass over here, cut a little audio treble over here, add a little reverb into it, and sell it to you as a whole nother thing. But what we did is we put all those tools into the decoder that allow you as the user to now make those adjustments. So if you want every locomotive to sound different, great. Use the tools we've given you: a 7-band equalizer, the reverb, the prime mover pitch shift, which will take the shift of the pitch up and down, and add some echo reverb, and even change the volumes. But there's another friend of ours or a friend of mine anyway. I'm pretty sure you know who I'm talking about, but used to work in Santa Fe, in Kansas City. He worked in our Argentine yard, and he told me, he says, George, I've tried. A GP7 sounds like a GP7 sounds like a GP7. So it's marketing works. Unfortunately, however you want to look at it.
Sure.
But when you get a GP7, they're all pretty much going to sound the same. But the other factor that I'm not even bringing in is atmosphere. If I record this locomotive out on the road with no buildings around, I'm going to get a very different sound than when I'm recording an Argentine yard in downtown Kansas City with a whole lot of stuff going on around. And so, we try to get as far away from all of that as we can. Sometimes it's plausible, sometimes it's not. We have access to a friend that has a very extensive whistle collection. And so we actually go out to the Cumbres and Toltec and rent the locomotive and run it up, several miles out of even downtown Cumbres or downtown Chama, I'm sorry, kind of halfway to Cumbres Pass, because we're away from everything. And we hook each one of those steam whistles up to the locomotive and blow the whistle, because the whistle sounds different when you record it on air versus steam pressure. You get that wet sound of that whistle. Yeah. So there's some of that'll go into the recording process to make sure we're getting an authentic recording. And the whistles are on our steam decoders, for example, are labeled based on what we were told they were. But like, for example, one of the common questions I get is, where's the Santa Fe whistle? Well, the Santa Fe whistle is actually labeled as an 1/8 6 chime, because that's what it was. But they're used to hearing it as the Santa Fe whistle because that's what's on the 3751. And so it was an 1/8 6 chime, which is very accurate to what it is, but it wasn't only on the Santa Fe, but that's where the Santa Fe people are used to hearing it, because they chased the 3751. So there's a lot of that going in. But we try to be as authentic as possible. We get the recordings. And the other thing we do is we give you the full sound file. rather than slicing it down. That's part of what the equalizer is there for, is because one of the other brands that is out there was asked about an equalizer by one of our retailers. And he said, "Oh, that's great. You don't have to have that equalizer because we do that work for you." Well, what that told me was that they've already cut out the low frequencies, because speakers in an HO model probably can't reproduce those low frequencies anyway. And so by shortening up the audio files and cutting off some of that so that they can streamline it, it also downloads faster because the bit depth of that audio file isn't the same. So if you were to hook up our decoder to a fairly large speaker, you're going to get that low frequency. And you're going to love hearing it. And you're going to be like, "Oh my God, I sound like I'm right there." And so speaker strength, speaker management is one of the things that kind of limits what we hear, because the speakers in our models are technically tweeters by audio standards.
Right.
So a lot of that low frequency may be filtered out just by the physical capabilities of it.
Absolutely.
And so that's where the amplifier, the equalizer comes into play, because you can minimize the speaker's weaknesses. And so you find out where, like, our cube speakers that I know you guys are using and we use in our product line as well, are capable of reproducing down to 100 hertz. That's fairly low for a speaker, but the speaker, only being this big, can't reproduce that with much pressure, aka volume. And so that's why you put multiples of those in there. But your equalizer allows you to compensate for that. So if you put 4 cube speakers, let's say, in a model, now you're going to start hearing some of that 100, 150 hertz, whereas even with just 2 of them, you may not hear it more than a few feet away from the model. And so that allows you to kind of boost the frequency levels that you can hear to help fool our ears into hearing the low end.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about that low end, I can speak from experience with SoundTraxx Tsunamis anyways. Years ago, person had a switching layout at a show in Decatur, Illinois, which isn't far from the old Wabash yards. And since the layout was so small, instead of having the locomotive sound equipped, he had a pair of subwoofers from a car. And he basically made a mobile decoder and hooked it up to those speakers. I don't know all the specifics there, but people were fooled into thinking that it was the locomotive switching out behind the show, and it wasn't. It was actually a Tsunami 2. It was really impressive, because to get that type of volume, to get that kind of, you don't really, I've been around a lot of prime movers, 567, 645s. You don't necessarily hear them as much as you feel them with your inner ear. Your inner ear hears that because of the mass. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The way you guys have recorded those sounds and allowed us to manipulate those sounds too, it's just been a game changer.
Yeah.
So good stuff. George, do you have time for a few questions from our audience?
Yeah, I'm on no schedule. My wife's working late tonight, and so I'm here. I'll be here as long as you guys want to ask questions. Fire away. I'll be here, and we can go as long as you want.
Sounds great. I'm going to start with one that's for both of us, really. This is Split Rock. He says, "Will Athearn ever offer Bluenami in the Genesis line?" We're looking into it. Now, it's one of those things where I kind of describe it from my car background. It's real easy to drop a 5-liter into an old car on paper, but it's quite another thing to actually take that engine block and put it in an old car that was not designed for it in the first place. So what has to happen is our Athearn engineers have to look at our current lineup and see if they can be adapted for the Bluenami, and that's usually a question of space. Second of all, too, is we have to look at cost, because unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, George and I like to eat, and so we have to make money. And if we can do that, and we can do it at a price that we feel the customer will pay for, then we'll look into it. So to answer your question, Split Rock, we are looking into it. There's nothing been, no decisions have been made yet, but do know that we are looking into it.
I'll add that from the aftermarket perspective, the Bluenami is about $30 to $35 price difference between the Tsunami 2 and the Bluenami. And that for that $30, $35, you're basically getting the added hardware for the Bluetooth. A few dollars of that does go towards app development, because the app developers like to get paid too.
Right.
And so the question always becomes, you know, with our locomotive costs going up, are you willing to pay another $30 premium on top of that to cover the extra cost of the decoder for the Blue Nami? And that's the $1 million question. I personally, I think that's money under the bridge. It's easy because once you get the flexibility and you understand what you're getting for that $30, it's the $30 is nothing. But we as model railroaders see that $30 and go, oh my God, we got to panic and take the breaks. The last thing I'll say is you guys check out that split rock layout. That's a gorgeous layout.
It is. It is. I forget how nice that layout is. Here's one from Eduardo. He's hailing from Mexico, he was saying earlier. So, hey, Eduardo, thanks for joining us. He wants to know, do you have plans for a basic Blue Nami, something like the Econami version of the Blue Nami?
Econami, probably not, because the Econami is designed as a budget sound system. And so therefore it's our affordable basic, get you what you need and go. So I don't see that becoming a Blue Nami, but the non-sound motor, I've had multiple requests for because of running multiple locomotives together. So I would say it's on the radar, but I don't have a time frame or even anything formal to be announcing, but it's something we're looking into.
Here's one from Bearzilla. Can you upload new sound files to Blue Nami from the phone? You don't really need to, though, do you?
No, there's already in there. I mean, the technology is there. So, we basically added the Bluetooth chip to the Tsunami 2 technology. And so the Tsunami 2, the software and the hardware or the memory chips are pre-flashed before assembly goes on downstairs. So there's no way to physically change that without removing the chip off the board, reflashing it and putting it in there. So the software doesn't exist currently in there to change it. But kind of to Jim's point, with our steam locomotive, for example, you've got 90 whistles to choose from, 54 bell recordings, 10 exhaust chuffs, 10 air compressors, 8 dynamos. You can choose the different types of fuel that's being used. You can choose an articulated exhaust chuff with and without wheel slip. You can select a lifting, non-lifting injector. You can select power, reverse, manual Johnson bar. Without adjusting volume, there's 2.1 billion possible sound combinations in our steam decoder. Now, once you factor in diesels, because the diesels are more standardized, so to speak, so you have a 567, that's a 567. And then you get 44 different air horns to choose from. You've got 50 bell recordings. You got 4 different air compressors to choose from, different poppet valve or air dryer sounds. So you have a lot of choices built into the decoder to customize it. But even in the EMD decoder, for example, there's 9 different prime movers that span the generations of EMD. So if you put it in a F7 today and you want to put it in a SD70, let's say, you don't need to do anything to the decoder. You just take it out, put it in, reprogram a couple of the sound files, or sound selections, I should say. So instead of the 567 prime mover, you're now playing the 710. So you didn't need to change or download anything to the decoder. It's already built into there. And GE, Alco, and then, of course, our Land of Misfit Toys known as Baldwin and others, that adds an extra 0.1 billion possible sound combinations without touching volume, equalizer, reverb, or any of those other tools we talked about. That's just sound selections. And the reason I point that out is because let's go to steam for a second. Or actually, let's go to diesel because I can use this locomotive here behind me. Notice what's missing on this long hood, dynamic braking. I can take the dynamic braking, set the volume to 0, but still have the decoder behave as if it's a dynamic brake equipped locomotive. That's a profile, even though I'm not counting that in that 2.2 billion possible sound combinations through the Tsunami 2 product line, because I don't want to count volume, because if I count volume, then there's an infinite number, because you have 0 to 255 on over 50 different sound effects, volume plus master, and any combination of therein. So there's a lot more options and selectability for or customizability of those sounds than just simply sending a sound file. So at this moment in time, the Bluetooth, the Blue Nami does not allow you to update or change the sound files, but they're all loaded on there. So as long as you're taking an EMD, putting it in an EMD locomotive, you shouldn't have to change it out. If you are putting it in, like, say, a GE, just go get a GE decoder and you'll be fine.
Right. You're done. Yeah. Here's a good question. And if I'm assuming Ronald's talking about on the layout, because yeah, Blue Nami's new. You probably have some Tsunami 2 already. Can you run them together on the same layout?
Yes. So the Blue Nami, if you want to run the Blue Nami, they can attach to the Bluetooth chip on your phone, and then your friends can run their Tsunami 2 all day long. If you want to run them in the same train, you just use your DCC system, because, like I said, at the heart, there's still a DCC decoder. So they still will run on DCC, but you have the added advantage of then using it optionally from your smart device, your phone or tablet or whatever. You don't lose anything going Blue Nami. You gain the ability to use it also on your phone. And if you really wanted to, you can use the app to just make your sound selections, settings, adjustments, light effects, whatever you want to do, and then run it on your DCC system all day long with your Proto Throttle.
Yep, exactly. The other thing that I think we're kind of overlooking, but I know you and I have talked about this at shows, is I'm so tired of hearing some of the old guys say, "Oh, the hobby's dying, it's drying up, it's not the same as it was years ago." And yeah, you're absolutely right. The hobby is not what it was years ago. It's better. It's evolving. And in order for us to keep the younger folks in the audience on the hobby, this is one of the things that's really important, because, quite honestly, depending on your age, you've probably had a smart device in your hand for most of your life. And this is just another app that allows you to run a hobby on something you already have. And you remember, we used to have to buy radio throttles and things of that nature back in the past for our clubs. You don't have to do that anymore. If you have an Android or an iPhone and Blue Nami, you're ready to go. And like you stated earlier, if I take something that I've set up here in Illinois and I go back to my home club in Concord and I set up on the club layout, I don't have to worry about the Wi-Fi and all that other stuff. I've got everything I need right there on my phone, and I'm not interrupting anybody else's play value. I'm not taking anything away. Like you said, you're adding to it. And I think that's just a great system that you guys have come up with.
Yep, exactly. So like I said, you don't lose anything.
So Randall wants to know, George, you mentioned being in Carthage, Missouri. Have you ever railfanned BNSF's Athearn subdivision, which runs from Springfield, Missouri to Memphis, Tennessee?
I have actually never been to Carthage.
Wow.
I live in Durango, Colorado. I lived in Dallas, Fort Worth area, in Arlington, Texas, my whole life. So I've never actually been to Carthage. The closest I got a few years ago, I did a sales trip to some stores in Little Rock, and then railfanned the White River route, which is the railroad I was talking about, the old Mopac line. It's now the Missouri Northern Arkansas. But they would run, I ran all the way up through to Piatt, Arkansas. And I wanted to see the Piatt Tunnel, which was a rock formation opening up into a bridge. And so I went to go see that, but I had to get back because my flight was that afternoon. So I had to drive back to Little Rock and see it. So I've actually never been to Carthage, Missouri. I've been kind of around it, but I've never actually been. So no, I've never railfanned that particular area, but I'll put it on my radar when I have to go researching for my layout.
There you go. Here's a installation question from Ray. Ray says he has an old blue box AC 4400 CW in Chicago Northwestern. He's installing DCC with sound. He wants to know PCB or Athearn 21-pin sound. What would you recommend?
So I think Athearn sells the Economy or the RTR ready motherboards in their parts department.
Yes.
And they have that little metal clip that would snap on top of your blue box motor.
Yep.
Do that, use a 21-pin decoder. And then the biggest thing is just make sure your motor is isolated from the frame of that model, because the blue box carried the power through the frame to the motor. And underneath the motor, there were these two little teeth that then touched the frame, and that's how the power got to the motor. So you want to go in, you want to cut those out, and then just as an insurance policy, lay some insulative tape so that when you put the motor down, you have that air gap. But if there's something like Torx or whatever, you don't have to worry about it accidentally touching. Put that down. But then if you use their RTR 21-pin motherboard, I believe that 21-pin, you may have to speak to this, has the ability to attach 8 functions. I believe there's 8 function lighting outputs so that you don't lose anything. And then you can just plug in a 21-pin Tsunami or Blue Nami or Eco Nami of your choice. And that is regulated for LEDs as well.
That's right. That is right. Here's an interesting question. I think I know the answer to it, but I want you to answer it. Is with Blue Nami, is it a great option as a dedicated track cleaner with battery pack system?
Hadn't thought about that, but absolutely.
I would think so, yeah, as long as it's got power.
Yeah, because you don't have to worry about dirty track. Just power up the battery, put a track cleaning car behind it, and go.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense, and you're probably onto something there, Bio.
Yeah, great thought. Idea. I love it.
I'm hoping this guy, documents his work and puts it somewhere so we can see it, because some great stuff there. While I'm thinking about it too, you mentioned it, but I want the audience to know too. You have got a series of workshop videos over at the SoundTraxx YouTube channel, which I find extremely useful. You had said earlier in the program, nobody's really an expert. We're all learning. We all had to start somewhere. And, there's many times with everything going on, you forget things. And I can go to your YouTube channel. And the thing I love about that YouTube channel is you've got a locomotive in front of you. You're showing us how to program different options, different things into our locomotives. So if it's a Saturday afternoon and you want to learn something new on your Tsunami 2 or Econami equipped Athearn locomotive, you can go over to the SoundTraxx YouTube channel, grab some coffee, sit down with George, get your locomotive, get your controller out, and it's like having your own in-house tutor for SoundTraxx.
Well, and especially with the webinar series. The webinar series, there's 14 videos in total. We just recorded a new one just focusing on the audio tools that'll be posted on our YouTube channel soon. But these were done before Zoom was cool, so many years ago. And so we were learning a lot. And so the first 3, the information is what's important. The audio was not necessarily great because we didn't learn about filtering out and real audio and all this stuff. So the information's okay. I usually tell people, don't stress yourself going to the first 3. Start with 4. What is DCC? 5 is what is sound? It talks about the science of audio. We talked about air pressure and air pressure waves, and that's what we're hearing is sound. Dive deep into that with webinar 5. Then webinar 6 talks about CV programming. Webinar 7 is installation overview. 8 is teaches you how to solder. A lot of us, some of people, and don't take offense, don't always know the right end of the soldering iron to grab. And so the webinar 8 will teach you from the professionals how to solder, because our technicians downstairs that work on the floor, we have a biannual certification that has to happen. So every 2 years, our guys have to, our staff, I shouldn't say guys, our staff downstairs have to go through the certification again. And every 2 years they come out, they send a professional training technician, they get their certification in soldering. And so a lot of the things in that soldering class are taught from our certification classes that our technicians have to go through. Webinar 9 teaches you how to use the 3 major DCC systems. Again, that's not something that we have to do, but it helps you learn better and how to use it. So there's a lot of great information. If you're looking at a particular feature of the decoder, like say, for example, I was talking to a customer today, how do I set up my flashing ditch lights? Great. Go to youtube.com, search SoundTraxx, flashing ditch lights. Boom, there's 3 or 4 videos there. Watch them, and then make sure you have the user's guide nearby, because I specifically talk about the one that's in front of me. But for argument's sake, let's say you get an Athearn Genesis that has the ditch lights wired to the FX7 and FX8 lighting output. My CV51 and 52 are no longer relevant. The values are relevant, but the number isn't, because 51 and 52 set up the FX3 and 4, but 7 and 8 are on 56 and 57. I'm sorry, 55 and 56 for the lighting effects. And so that's where you want to have the user's guide. Take the information I give you, refer to the user's guide, make sure you understand what we're telling you, experiment. The best thing about a SoundTraxx decoder is you cannot break it by changing a CV value. You may get some strange behavior, but you didn't break it. And the reason for that is because we built safeguards into the software. So I talked about 44 air horns. Let's say, for argument's sake, you're going in and you fat finger and accidentally hit whistle or air horn number 55. Oops. Now my decoder's looking for data that's not there, but there's no data, so it can't do anything beyond that. And that's how a lot of these software programs get broken with other brand decoders, because they're looking for data that doesn't exist, and they can't move on until they get the data. So you end up with that standoff. But what we have is we built into the software that has an algorithm that knows the range and says, okay, you only have 44 choices. So if I try to pick 55, the decoder's like, that's not a choice, and defaults you back to 0, so that way you can't break the decoder. So worst case, experiment, play around with it. What I used to tell people is grab the manual and flip through it and say, okay, today I'm going to look at lighting. Okay, CV51 is the light. Okay, what does the Mars light look like? Oh, that's cool. All right, now I'm going to program the gyro light. Oh, I see the difference. Okay, what's a strobe light look like? Oh, okay, and work your way through. And then as you get there, not only are you getting practice with programming your decoder, but you're also getting that experience, so that you may see a lighting effect there that we call something, but may be perfectly used for something else. And a case in point of that was, I have an 1860s model, the General. Everybody knows the world famous General locomotive 440 that lives in Kennesaw, Georgia. And in that model in 1860, they didn't have electric lights. No. So that light being bright and solid wouldn't necessarily be the case. So what I did was I repurposed our ash pan light to now become my headlight. So it's a little bit of a flicker, kind of like an oil lamp, but it's not an aggressive flicker like a firebox. So by doing this and experimenting with the decoder, you may find something in there that you didn't know existed that may suddenly become the coolest thing ever to you. And the good thing is you didn't break it. If you don't like what you did, reset the decoder and start over. Just take notes where you are. And the cool thing about the Blue Nami app is Android has it. Apple will be getting it soon. There is a save where I can save a locomotive profile in my app. So if I go in and make a change and I don't like it, I can restore my last saved setting.
Right. Yeah.
Or I can copy locomotives.
Yeah, a couple of things there to discuss real quick. One, going back to the flashing ditch lights. I'm seeing in the comments, it's like, yeah, I'm trying to do that with mine. It's not working. Well, one thing you got to remember, if it's a Genesis locomotive, Genesis is built on what? Prototypical accuracy. So what that basically means, if you get a Norfolk Southern or CSX locomotive that in real life is going to have alternating ditch lights when the horn is depressed, it will. If you have another railroad, though, that doesn't have alternating flashing ditch lights when the horn is pressed in real life, nor will the Athearn Genesis one. My favorite story about that is when we did the SD60Ms a couple of years ago in Burlington Northern, and I had a guy come up to me at the show and say, Jim, every time I hit the horn, the lights flash, but they don't quite alternate. They just kind of blink all wonky. And I said, that's because they're not ditch lights. And he looked at me odd, and he says, what do you mean they're not ditch lights? I said, because when they took delivery of those locomotives, BN was in the midst of trying to figure out a better way to have visibility at grade crossings. There was a lot of grade crossing accidents. And since the Tiger Stripes didn't really work, they went to this. These were strobes. And so what happens is the researcher for Athearn says, okay, these are strobes. We're going to tell SoundTraxx to program that lighting in there. So instead of an alternating ditch light, you guys randomly put a strobe to it, and it's authentic to the actual locomotive. So just keep that in mind with Genesis. Something else I want to bring up too while I'm thinking of it. Not only does SoundTraxx have a great support system, but your dealer who carries SoundTraxx, 9 times out of 10, they've been trained by SoundTraxx. SoundTraxx will actually train dealers that carry SoundTraxx products. Also, our technicians at Athearn that work on warranty and repairs for Athearn products, they're trained by George. George has actually done a lot of training seminars with our folks in the service center at Athearn. And on top of all of that, I mean, that is quite the service network. But you know what? If it's a day where I just can't find what I'm looking for, somebody over at SoundTraxx is going to answer my phone call, or I'm going to leave a message, and guess what? They're going to get back to you. That's the great thing about SoundTraxx. It's not just a magic box. There's people behind there, knowledgeable people like yourself, George, that are more than willing to help you get the most out of your decoder. So let's see, I've got another question here. Let's see, from Mr. Rick Schmidt. He says, are there any plans to install the Bluenami factory, Bluenami 1 factory Athearn models? Also, one gripe I have is a lack of resistors in the SoundTraxx Tsunami 2 and Bluenami boards. Is it something possible in the future? Well, the first one we kind of already answered earlier about, cost and logistics, but George, do you want to take that second part of the question?
So a lot of the Tsunami 2 and Bluenami do not have the LED resistors on the board. The reason for that is if we go back to our original Tsunami line, we had a AT1000, we had a GN1000, which was regulated for the 1.5 volt lights that Athearn Genesis was using. We had AT was Atlas, kind of a generic all-encompassing board. Then we had the KT1000, which was designed for Kato. Then we had the BW, which was for Bowser. And then we had the IM, which was for Intermountain. And those had pre-regulated resistors on the board. In an aftermarket setting, this is where the challenge comes into play, because that same BW board, I can sell to 3 people, and 2 people are going to gripe about the lights. One says it's too bright, the other says it's too dim, third guy, just right, the story of Goldilocks. And so from a manufacturing perspective, we're usually going to go on the side of caution and go with a higher resistor value, just because we don't know what you're going to do with it. So we kind of would say, if we put a 10,000 ohm resistor on there, your LED is probably still going to be, bright, but the guy that wants the retina burners isn't going to be happy. And we had several installers in that time. He would be installing in a Bowser model, but he absolutely refused to buy the BW1000s because he hated how dim the lights were. And then there's another friend of mine that I've been to his layout, and he couldn't be so proud as how bright his headlights were in his 1977 layout. He had these building lights, and then he had one of these big, those triple wide giant industrial dump trucks that the lights, you could see them next door. And he was so proud of that. Look at how bright these lights are. I'm like, I can't see anything. I see spots now. But my point being is that where is that value come into play to make everybody happy? And then you have also the wide range of different types of resistors. LEDs that are out there. You've got the small surface mount ones, which, yes, are becoming more and more popular, but they take a different resistor value than, say, a 3mm LED. And what is the person going to be installing? Most people nowadays, when they're doing their own work, are using those micro LEDs. But honestly, I still get occasionally where somebody will call up looking for 1.5 volt light bulbs settings. It's not as often, but I will be saying it's lowering. But you've got Athearn for years was using the 1.5 volt light bulbs. Really the pioneer for the light in the housing itself. Everybody else did an LED behind a lens. So kudos to them for that. But there were so many models over the years that were 1.5 volt light bulbs that people are still converting those old ones up. So adding the resistors in is kind of a challenge, because if I put resistors in for LEDs, then that guy that has the 1.5 volt light bulbs, now his lights won't illuminate. And now he's all upset. And so by making it a universal that will fit into any model without the resistors is a little bit more sellable to say than telling the guys that don't use 1.5 volt to now, well, sorry, you have to convert your stuff to LEDs. And then the other side of it is of the LED users. You can have some that say it's too bright, some that say it's too dim. And so this gives you that flexibility to be able to put the resistor value in that works for you. I know it's a little bit more tedious per se, but the end result is that you get what you want out of the model. And so when we built the Athearn Genesis decoders, the GN2200 and their Economy boards, we actually worked with their design team to specify their resistors and how bright they wanted the models to appear in their way. when you get the model from Athearn. And so what you're looking at is the end result of a large collaboration to adjust the brilliance of those LEDs so that they look realistic from a perspective. Because again, let's look at this model behind me. This 1978 model didn't even have halogen light bulbs, or if they were at their very infancy. You know, compared to say today's modern Gevo, where you've got not only halogen, but you've got those what are they called? What are the new ones called now? They've got something. They're the ones you get, those super bright ones like you see on the cars now. When you're driving past them, you think they have their high beams on. You're like, turn them off, and they're like, no, this is my normal light. But my point being is that even going back to, we had to look at the era that you're modeling in, and that's another way that you can use the decoders to model the era, because your lights shouldn't appear so bright that you're looking at a modern day light bulb if you're modeling a 1920s steam locomotive. And so that gives you the flexibility to put the resistor value in for the LEDs you choose so that you get the brilliance you desire. And I realized probably most of the people, maybe 60% of the people don't care, but that's it, that 40% will, and then they'll make a big stink about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Going back to that, one of the folks in the audience, let's see, I'm looking for, Carolina Foothills Railroad. He said, yeah, I got you, Jim, on the ditch lights that flashing together. But he went on to say that this is a Wisconsin Central. It's been patched for my railroad. I use alternating ditch lights. So meaning that what he got from the factory was set up for, just standard ditch lights, and his patch railroad used alternating. Well, as long as you've got 8 functions, right? You've got 8 lighting functions with the Tsunami 2. You can take the shell off. If you look carefully, if it's a factory one, there's some like covers that hold those wires to those. It's going to take a little bit of remapping on that, isn't it, George? But you can do it. It's not that hard to make those lighting functions.
Yeah, in that particular case, both of those ditch lights are wired to the same physical output.
Right.
So what Jim's talking about is you're going to take them and separate them. So instead of saying both they're wired to the FX7, let's say, you're going to take the other one and leave one at FX7, one at FX8, or FX5, whatever's open on the model. And then you can go in and with your CVs, or in the case of a Blue Nobby, you can make the adjustments, but this is a factory install. So there you're going to go in, and that's where you have the user's guide, because their factory install settings are not always the same as our aftermarket settings. So what you're going to want to do is know, okay, I wired this to the FX6, let's say. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to find the FX6 map register. I'm going to set that value to 5, let's say, so it turns on with the other ditch light. Okay, now I want the alternating ditch light. So you're going to set the FX7 light to alternating ditch light type 1, phase A, crossing logic, and then you're going to do the same thing for FX6, which is alternating or ditch light type 1, phase B with crossing logic enabled, and that's where you get the alternating flashing. So if they're flashing together, that means they're wired to the same output. So you have to go in and open it up and move a wire. I don't think I've specifically showed that, but in the video on our YouTube channel, this model that's behind me here, I actually show you how I add those class lights. Let me get out of the way. I actually show you how to add the class lights and show you how to do the wiring to the decoder. And I can't remember off the top of my head if I actually showed you the CV settings to do it. But it's just a matter of making some adjustments. And then worst case, if you're not sure where you're starting, go to our website, SoundTraxx.com, go to support. At the bottom of the link on support, there's a link to factory installed decoders. Click on Athearn, click on the Genesis, and look for the model that you have, that your model started life as. Because when you find it, you'll find a CV default list for that model, including all the lighting effects, all those volume CV settings, and every adjustment, so that way you know where you're starting from, so that you can then go in and make your adjustments accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. Got time for one more question, and I think I'll end it tonight with Anthony. Anthony says, George, what is the easiest way to speed match Consys SoundTraxx engine with a non-SoundTraxx engine? I have a problem in speed match with different decoders.
So his question is, what's the easiest way? You take out that other brand decoder, you buy a Tsunami 2 or a Blue Nami, and you plug it right in place.
There you go.
Knew I had to, or I couldn't resist that much.
Yeah, it was an easy setup.
All right, so that's not the answer he wanted.
No.
The easiest way is honestly dedicate time. Because our decoders, first of all, internally, our decoders have 2,048 internal speed steps. Visibly through your DCC system, there's 127 or 28 or 14. But with momentum settings, back EMF settings and adjustments, things like that, our decoders actually have a very refined motor control. But when you go into the decoder, you can set it up in one of two ways. You have the 3-point speed table, which is CV2 V-start, which in my opinion is obsolete. And I'll get into a further conversation on that if you want, George B at SoundTraxx.com. And then you have V-mid and V-max. And what this does is this allows you to set basically a 3-point speed table so you can do it quickly, down and dirty, slightly up, slightly down. But what happens is you have different variations in the mechanism at a different speed. Suddenly something may free up a little bit or the grease gets warm or whatever the case is. And so we actually have the alternate speed setting, which gives you the 28 speed steps of 28 speed step, so that you can actually go in and adjust the percentage of throttle applied at speed step 1 of 28, 2 of 28, 3 of 28, 4 of 28, blah, 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 and so on to 28 of 28. Now, if you're the guy that wants to be able to run a train with 2 locomotives, holding a coupler holding a piece of paper between the couplers and never drop the piece of paper, you can do that. It's just not a 5-minute process.
Right.
You're going to have to go in and actually adjust it. So the flexibility built into the SoundTraxx decoders allows you to match to anything. So what you're going to do is you're going to set your throttle to 28 speed steps. You're going to grab your other brand decoder. You're going to put it on the track. You're going to run it at speed step 1. Then you're going to do the same thing to the SoundTraxx decoder. And when they're running, you're going to see them running together. And one may be faster, one may be slower, whatever the case. And you adjust. You keep the other brand at the same because they probably don't have the same flexibility. So you're going to adjust our percentage of speed step 1. You're going to adjust CV67 up or down until they match. When they match, great. Exit out of your programming mode. Go to speed step 2. Do the same thing for CV68 and adjust it up and down until they match. And so easy, not necessarily. Time consuming, it may take a little bit of time, but it might be easier than you think. Long term, what you want to do is you want to make sure you have the same master locomotive through all this process. You know the adage they always say, copies of copies of copies. So you have one master locomotive and match everything to it. And so that way we know how they're going to run. And then I can take 2 or 3 of the matched locomotives and run them together, and you're going to have minimal coupler bump. But now I'm going to throw a little bit of personal thing into here. I'm going to take the name off my shirt for a moment. In the real world, couplers bump and buck. Real locomotives do this all the time. The difference is model railroaders and rail fans, when we're videotaping, we don't see it because it happens either right before our camera or right after our camera, but rarely does it happen right there in camera where we see the couplers do this. So out of the box, most of your decoders are fairly closely speed matched. I mean, if you have one that's significantly slower, okay, I get it. But for the most part, I don't speed match my models unless I have one like that, because in the real world, they'll buck and bump a little bit. And what it does, it gives you that more realistic effect. Plus, you can run your trains a little bit quicker, meaning less time playing with CVs and adjusting. But then the last thing is once you add some momentum and you put a train behind it, the bucking goes away. Right. Because now you have the load of that train pulling on those couplers. And so it's a whole lot less likely that you have one locomotive now that's suddenly jumping because it's cleared some rough spot in a gear or something like that, because the load of the train is going to actually pull those couplers tight, which again mimics the real world physics. Right. We're just doing it with plastic and weights involved as opposed to a metal locomotive, a metal freight car. So next time when you're out rail fanning and you hear those big kaboom type sounds, that's those couplers bumping in and out of each other. They're not tight like we want them to be, but easy. Change the other brand out to SoundTraxx. time consuming. You can do it with a SoundTraxx decoder to match to any brand out there, which is why we built that flexibility into it, is because we know not everybody does that. So we gave you the tools to be able to match whatever it is that's out there. And like I said, if you want to talk about CV2, email me, georgeb@soundtraxx.com, and I'll give you the dissertation on that, because I know we're already running an hour over what the normal extras are. So we'll have that conversation offline.
Yeah, and then Terry, I see your question. Terry briefly is asking, he's saying in his experience anyways, Athearn trains run much faster than any other brand of locomotive, in some cases like running a rabbit versus a turtle. Why is that, and is there a way to get them dialed in closely? Well, again, the great thing about Economy or Tsunami 2 equipped locomotives, and if that's what you're talking about, Terry, is you can dial that in, for what you might consider fast, somebody else might consider slow. Again, we set the parameters to what we think the average modeler enjoys, but the beauty of Tsunami 2 in an Economy is you can set that. And I've done that myself, again, going back to the proto throttle. I'm like, man, notch 1, and this is another pet peeve of mine. People think that notch 1, the prime mover, is going to make some noise. I've operated full scale EMDs. That's not how it works.
Oh, I got a whole story on. I got a whole
Yeah.
story on that again, but I'll save that for another time.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when your locomotive isn't hooked up to anything, there's nothing to, notch 1, it's idling. It's just moving along. It's not until it actually feels a load and the exciters kick in. So, but anyways, going back to my original example, I'm like, man, that's just too fast. I can go in there and I can fine tune that. My starting voltage, my all of that can be adjusted. So take a look at that, and if you still are having some questions on how to wrap your head around that, again, go to the SoundTraxx website. There's some great webinars as well as some how-to videos on doing all of those things. And yeah,
I'll add one other thing. Look at CV215. CV215 is what's called back EMF reference voltage. It's defaulted at 15 or 150, which represents 15.0 volts. And so what you may be running on, like say if you're on a power cab, which is running at 13.5 volts, and your decoder is sort of auto overcompensating, because the back EMF readings at 13 volts is going to be a whole lot different than at 15 volts. So dial that in first, start with 215 down to, I usually set mine about 12. So value of 120, because it represents 12.0 volts. You can do 135 for 13.5 volts. Start there. That may help. But for the most part, also make sure your throttle is in 128 speed step mode, because I've talked to numerous people over the years that they tell me their decoder runs too fast. And I said, well, are you in 128 speed step mode or 28? And he goes, well, I'm in 28. I always run at 28. Well, that's great, but you're essentially jumping to speed step 5.
Yep.
And so why would you jump that? Because yeah, you're going to run it. I actually had one of our retailers take an Athearn model and review it and said, oh, it's too fast out of the package. I said, hey, reshoot that and put it at speed step 128. And he goes, oh yeah, it does run a lot slower. I said, yeah. So he took that video down, reshot it, and posted it up, because I called him out on it, because there's a big difference when you're jumping at speed step 1 versus speed step 5. As I mentioned, we have 2,048 speed steps through that 128 range. So how many do we have before mechanical DCC command number 1? You can do the math. And so that's why I say, make sure you're running in 128 speed step mode, because you're going to use the smallest increments between speed steps, and add a little momentum too, because if you're jumping, say, to speed step 10 with no momentum, yeah, it's going to jackrabbit start. It's going to immediately jump to speed step 10 because there's no momentum. So always add a little bit of that, because real locomotives are big, heavy machines, and they take a lot of effort to get going. So those two things will help get you started. If you still have further questions, either email me, georgeb@soundtraxx.com. Let me know you were on this live video, or you can email support@soundtraxx.com and get Norman, and he'll be able to help you as well.
Thanks a lot, George. This has been a great show, and it's allowed me to geek out a little bit. You and I talk about this stuff even offline, because we're always dreaming up new ways of enjoying our models. You've been a huge help with me with my proto throttle too. So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for coming on board tonight. Again, folks, take a look in the description below. You'll see links to not only SoundTraxx, but George's own layout. And now that it's getting to be the cooler season, you're probably going to see some more updates on that. And, we didn't talk about another hobby that you have, and that's hockey. That's going to be coming up here for you pretty soon too, isn't
That
it?
starts in a month.
In a month.
And that's actually going to take a lot of my evenings because I play on 2 hockey teams and then I play Old Man League, which is over 40. And so that's 3 skates a week at night. And the adults are always after the kids. So my skate times don't start till 9:30 or 10:45 at night.
Wow.
So that takes up a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's going to take up some time, but we'll see you at the next show, I'm sure. So George, once again, thanks a lot for coming on board tonight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for answering our questions online, and we'll talk to you soon.
Always happy to help answer any questions, and always happy to do this. So I look forward to maybe getting a invite back a little sooner than later.
Yeah, let's do that. The funny thing is we did talk about that. And you know what? If you're watching this video live or you're watching it after the fact and you really enjoy this kind of content, let us know in the comments. Do you want to see more videos with George and I getting together talking about what you can do with your Athearn and Athearn Genesis models with the Economies and the Tsunami 2s? You want to get more out of it? Do you want to do more than get beyond locomotive number 3 and actually have a cab number and do some stuff? Let us know in the comments. If you want to see stuff like that, I think we can make that happen. What do you think?
I'm game. Let's do it.
There we go. All right. Always exciting and great to work with you, George. I appreciate it. And for everyone else out there, you know what? Fall's around the corner. Get started to work on the layouts. We'll switch from rail fan season to actual model railroad season. So with that, I want everyone out there to be happy, be healthy, be safe, do some good modeling, and above all, high greens. Good night, everyone.